My name is Alex Steffler. I'm the Data and Learning Manager here at Read by Fourth. And I'd like to just start by welcoming everyone to today's Lunch and Learn. This is the second Lunch and Learn that we are holding in 2022, and we plan to continue holding them roughly monthly throughout the rest of the year. As always, we hope you'll continue to join us. Our next Lunch and Learn will take place in about a month on Wednesday, May 25th. So please stay tuned to our Read by Fourth newsletters and social media for updates about that next Lunch and Learn. In a moment, I will pass the mic, so to speak, over to our presenter, Laura Boyce. But first, I wanted to just remind everyone about the intended format of these Lunch and Learns. So the idea is to have these be more of a conversation among all of us, rather than just a Q&A. So you can think of it a little bit like a book club. Laura will give us an overview of her topic, and then we'll open it up for a discussion between each other. And the hope is that this way we'll facilitate learning and help each other take action and find new ways of understanding kind of all of our roles in this area. One last programming note, today's session is being recorded and we will be posting it on the Read by Fourth YouTube channel after the event. I will also send out a post-event survey just to collect some feedback about how these Lunch and Learns are going. So please look for that in your inboxes later today. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker, Laura Boyce. Laura is the Pennsylvania Executive Director of Teach Plus, which empowers teachers to take leadership over policy and practice issues that advance equity, opportunity, and student success. Laura leads Teach Plus Pennsylvania's policy and advocacy work, and she brings her experience as a former teacher and principal herself to her current work. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Laura. And Laura, let me make sure that you are you should be able to go ahead and
I think I'm good. I'm one click away from sharing my screen. So hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Alex, and thanks to the whole Read by Fourth team for having me here today. It's nice to see some familiar faces and also some people that I don't know. So I'm really excited to talk with you all today about how public policy is supporting our youngest readers in Pennsylvania. I am going to be trying to translate for you the very complex regulatory process here in Pennsylvania. This is a level of policy that they didn't cover on Schoolhouse Rock. It gets a little bit complicated, but my goal is to make it really, simple and understandable for you in terms of what some of the newest regulations mean for how our future educators will be prepared to support young readers in Pennsylvania. Alex shared the mission of Teach Plus, so I won't do a dramatic reading of that again. I'll just say we are a national nonprofit. We've been in Pennsylvania since 2017. I always like to include pictures of some of the teacher leaders that we work with. This is one of our teacher leaders, Morgan Craig Williams from B.B. Comegys Elementary in Southwestern PA. In Philadelphia, we work with teacher leaders who are leading grade teams to improve instruction, including incorporating the science of reading and evidence-based practices into their instruction. Across Pennsylvania, we have a few different types of programs. We, on the policy side, lead a statewide teaching policy fellowship where we empower teachers to learn about different education policy issues and advocate for equitable education policies, including the ones we're going to talk about today. We also, as I mentioned, have teacher-led professional learning programs where we work with teachers to lead the learning of their peers and improve instruction. And we've got a statewide teacher network of over 450 teachers across the state who are learning about education policy and leadership and how they can make their voices heard. So I'm going to do a quick plug. If you are an educator yourself, either current or former or future, we invite you to join our Pennsylvania Teacher Network to have access to monthly opportunities to learn about all different kinds of educational policy issues, other equity issues in Pennsylvania. So we'd love to see you in that network if you are so inclined. So I'm going to be talking about two different changes to Pennsylvania teacher certification regulations today. One involves training teachers in the science of reading, and one involves training teachers to be culturally relevant and sustaining educators. So I'm going to start with the science of reading, and this is going to be a pretty quick trip through the research on the science of reading, why it's needed and how it's being advanced in Pennsylvania. I know your previous Lunch and Learn was all about the science of reading, and many of you don't need to be convinced on this topic. So I'm going to just do a very brief refresher for those of you who couldn't join last month or who just are a little bit rusty. And as we know, far too many kids can't read at an early age. We wouldn't be here as a coalition, the Read by Fourth campaign, if we were seeing early reading outcomes that matched what our students are capable of and what they deserve. We know from research that about 95% of students, if given the right instruction in the early grades, can learn to read, but only about 30% of students are capable of reading kind of regardless of the environment. You just sort of, they're going to pick it up. They're going to figure out the code of reading on their own. For the vast majority of our students, they are able to learn to read, but they require the systematic and science-based reading instruction to be able to read on grade level. And then there's a small percentage of students who do struggle even with those supports. We know that according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is the national cross-state assessment, that fourth grade reading scores remain very low, and that the failure to read on grade level by fourth grade is correlated with a lot of different negative outcomes, both academically and in terms of life outcomes. Some of these images are from a great report called Narrowing the Third Grade Reading Gap that I would recommend, that goes into a lot of depth about this issue. So the good news is we know how kids learn to read. There's been a lot of neuroscience and other scientific research that has really helped us to understand how our brains learn to understand the code of reading, which is not something that we're sort of evolutionarily designed to do on our own. Which parts of our brains are activated as we learn to read. And you've probably heard about the simple view of reading and Scarborough's reading rope, which are two different frameworks that help to explain how we learn to both decode and comprehend the words that are on the page in order to understand what we're reading and to read on grade level. But unfortunately, many of our teachers, including myself when I went through teacher preparation, are not trained in this science of reading, which has become a pretty well-established body of knowledge at this point. There's a lot of research on some of the limitations of our current teacher preparation systems. 60% of elementary teachers have never been trained in strategies for teaching phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary fluency, and comprehension. 95% of early elementary classrooms spend insufficient time providing direct instruction on phonemes. And 80% of early elementary teachers encourage students to use shortcuts to actually decoding words that can be counterproductive in the long run to their development as readers. And that's correlated with some research of what's actually happening within teacher preparation programs, where many of them don't devote enough or any time to the science of reading, and particularly the science of learning to decode and the phonemic awareness, the phonics, and so forth. We are seeing improvements over time, and many of you are doing great work in educator preparation programs and with educator preparation programs across Pennsylvania, but it's still inconsistent. And up until now, there were no policy requirements at the state level that all educator preparation programs include instruction in the science of reading. So as of this past Saturday, the new Chapter 49 teacher certification regulations have been through the entire regulatory process and adopted. So this is I told you I would tell you a little bit, but not too much about the regulatory process. You know that one way that policy is made is through the legislature passing laws. And so our General Assembly in Pennsylvania passes laws that can require different bodies to do different things related to education. Another way that policy gets made is through regulation. And so the Pennsylvania State Board of Education has the ability to pass and to update regulations that are then requirements or binding for educator preparation programs as they prepare teachers to get certified. And so every 10 years, the teacher certification regulations, Chapter 49, are up for revision. And that's a years-long process of getting input from the field and reviewing and then going through several different bodies for approval, from the State Board of Education to the Independent Regulatory Review Commission to finally the Attorney General, who just approved these new regulations on Saturday. And so the good news is, in these new regulations, they call for future educators, anyone who's getting certified to be an early childhood educator, an elementary or middle school educator, a special educator from pre-K to 12, an English as a second language teacher, or a reading specialist. Anyone in any of those certification categories is required to be trained in structured literacy. And when we talk about what structured literacy is, you can see the full definition down here. It's defined as systematic, explicit instruction that provides a strong core of foundational skills in the language systems of English. I'm not going to read through the rest of it, but suffice it to say, structured literacy is very aligned with the science of reading, and it deals with some of those pieces that we mentioned are often lacking in traditional educator preparation programs. And so these regulations say future teachers have to be trained in the structured literacy approach, and that the educator preparation programs have to integrate structured literacy into both coursework and field experiences. That's the student teaching and the practice opportunities that future educators get before they go into the classroom. I did see the one question in the chat. The regulations, these particular regulations, teacher certification regulations, are supposed to be reviewed every 10 years. In practice, it often ends up being a little bit longer than that. In some regulations, there's not specific requirements of how often they have to be updated, and it's up to the body. And some regulations are State Board of Education regulations. The Department of Education also is in charge of other regulations. So it's a very complicated process, but these will likely be in place for at least the next 10 years. So I'm going to keep on moving and share with you now one other change to educator preparation that was also a part of the Chapter 49 updates, and that is related to culturally relevant and sustaining education. You might be wondering, well, what does this have to do with Read by Fourth and the science of reading? So I'm going to try to make that connection for you in just a little bit. But first, let me tell you a little bit about why culturally relevant and sustaining education is needed. There's a lot of research that suggests that training teachers to be culturally responsive or culturally proficient or culturally relevant, these terms are used interchangeably, leads to positive outcomes for all students, especially students of color. And the way that the research has started to show that this happens is that teachers who are trained to be culturally responsive are more likely to have high expectations for all students, regardless of their background, and also more likely to overcome biases that those teachers might have. We know from the research that teachers come into teaching with similar levels of racial bias as the general population has. We know that all of us are, as we sort of encounter the sort of like systemic racism within our country, and it's sort of in the air we breathe, we all learn implicit biases that we might not be aware of, but that do affect our actions, and teachers are not exempt from that. And so it's important for teachers to receive training to help them to identify and recognize those biases and overcome them. This bias has been measured in teachers and has also been found to correlate with differences in expectations based on race or other outcomes, differences in the way they instruct students from different backgrounds, differences in the level of respect and the way that they behave towards those students, discipline rates. There are very high disparities in discipline based on race for students of color, and to have an effect on achievement and engagement. Connected to this, we see that in many schools across the Commonwealth and across the country, the books that students are reading are often predominantly featuring white characters or written by white authors. The artists and the other sort of historical and notable figures they're exposed to are predominantly white. The education theory that teachers are exposed to in education programs is dominated by white thinkers. And so all of that has an impact on the way that teachers come into the classroom and the way that they interact with their students. Just to point to one piece of literature, a recent report from Teach Plus called To Be Who We Are, which we conducted in partnership with the Center for Black Educator Development, also found from talking to teachers of color that having culturally relevant and sustaining education in place in schools helps to retain teachers of color who overall have been found to be more culturally responsive and to get better outcomes with students of color. This is just connected to that last fact, a map you might have seen, I find very striking. This is a map from our friends at Research for Action that shows the number of school districts in Pennsylvania with 0 teachers of color. The bright red is districts with 0 teachers of color. It's about 36% of all school districts in Pennsylvania. 50% of all schools in Pennsylvania have 0 teachers of color. You can see there's only 2 districts in the entire Commonwealth, Philadelphia and Chester Upland, who have at least 20% teachers of color. And even that is, far fewer than the percentage of students of color within their districts. The overall gap between students of color in Pennsylvania, which make up 36% of the student body, compared to teachers of color, which make up only 6% of the teaching workforce, is one of the largest gaps in the entire country. This connects to culturally relevant and sustaining education for 2 reasons. Number one, because as I mentioned, teachers of color have been found to be more likely to be culturally responsive. And so if we can get more teachers of color, we will naturally have more culturally responsive education, but also because if our schools are not culturally responsive, that is something that makes teachers of color less likely to enter or stay in the workforce. So it's kind of a cycle where we need to be thinking about it from both ends. We have been doing some research with educator preparation programs about how well they're already integrating culturally responsive education into their programs. This is some preliminary research. We're going to be releasing the official report in June. But we asked educator preparation programs how confident they are in the ability of their faculty and staff as a whole to support pre-service and in-service educators in becoming culturally relevant and sustaining educators. And you'll see we've got about a third of we got responses from over 100 faculty and staff. About a third of these staff believe they're very confident that their programs are doing this. The plurality are somewhat confident in their current ability to train teachers to be culturally relevant. And then you'll see almost a quarter are either slightly confident or not at all confident. So we've definitely got work to do. How does this connect to reading? We also have in Pennsylvania some of the largest racial achievement gaps in the country. These are images from the 4th grade reading assessments, and you'll see the white black difference. So the gap between the performance of white students and Black students in terms of their 4th grade reading scores on the NAEP is the 5th highest in the country. And the gap between white students and Hispanic students is the 3rd largest in the country for 4th grade reading. So when we think about these gaps, obviously, to close the gaps, we also need to be improving teachers' ability to teach according to the science of reading. But we have to also think about, how are teachers' expectations and biases and mindsets impacting and leading to these gaps. And so there's a really important piece that training teachers to be more culturally responsive plays in addressing these achievement and opportunity gaps that are so large by race. So Chapter 49, which I mentioned earlier, was just updated, also includes requirements that all future educators be trained in culturally relevant and sustaining education, which is sometimes abbreviated to be CRSE. And just like with structured literacy, the programs must incorporate culturally relevant and sustaining education into both their curricula as well as their field experiences. Culturally relevant and sustaining education is defined as education that ensures equity for all students and seeks to eliminate systemic barriers. And you can read the full definition there. But we are really excited for what this might mean for our future educators, both teachers of color and white educators who are being prepared to better serve our wonderfully diverse students within our Commonwealth in a way that's going to achieve equitable outcomes. So what's next in terms of the implementation of these different regulations? The Pennsylvania Department of Education, now that they have been finalized by the Attorney General, is going to be responsible for developing competencies related to both structured literacy and culturally relevant and sustaining education that will really go into more specific detail about the exact types of knowledge and skills that educators need to meet to sort of be trained in structured literacy and culturally relevant education. And then there's going to be support needed by educator prep programs in order to really integrate these competencies into their programs. That's one of the reasons we're doing that survey that I showed you data from, is to identify what types of support will be needed from the Department of Education, from other professional development providers, from the field, to really help them to do this well and not to just check a box and say, yeah, we're doing it, without making meaningful changes. The Department of Education is also opening a different regulation, Chapter 354, which governs educator preparation, so that they can also incorporate these new requirements into the larger process of reviewing educator preparation programs for accreditation. And then these things mostly focus on future educators, but we know that we've got a lot of current educators who also need training in structured literacy and the science of reading, as well as in culturally relevant and sustaining education. And so there has not been any policy change in that area yet. And so that's another area that Teach Plus and others in the policy and advocacy space are going to continue to push for, and hopefully work with districts to, even before it's required, start putting into place more professional development opportunities. This is just one more graph from our survey of educator preparation programs on the types of support that they say they need in order to become better at training their teachers to be culturally relevant and sustaining educators. So some of the top things that they said that they needed are professional development opportunities for current faculty and staff to learn about culturally relevant and sustaining education, communities of practice to learn from and problem solve with peer institutions, and sample course curricula and other materials from institutions that have already incorporated culturally relevant and sustaining education. I suspect if we were to do a survey with those same programs about structured literacy, you would probably see some similar suggestions and responses in terms of the types of supports that they'll need. And so I know we've got some funders in the room, as well as, you know, potentially some policy makers. We're hoping that we'll see steps taken to provide some of those supports to educator preparation programs, so that their faculty and staff are equipped to really do a good job with training our future educators in both structured literacy and cultural relevance. So I was tasked with keeping my presentation to about 20 minutes. So I think I'm basically there, and I'm going to stop sharing now so that we can hopefully have a conversation about this content, answer questions, and get your reactions, particularly as we think about, you know, what's next and where we go from here.
I have a
Thank
question.
you, Laura. Yeah,
If that's okay.
yeah, go ahead, Jill.
Hi, Laura, thank you very much. Spoken at high speed and very rich, so I'm glad we're going to get a copy of the slides. Thank you. In terms of teaching the science of reading or structured literacy, our program, the Wilson Reading System, is that considered one of the means of identifying and teaching the science of reading?
That's not specified within the existing regulations. I imagine that as the part, sort of in this next stage, as the department is developing the competencies for structured literacy, as well as the implementation guidelines, they will be looking to identify some of those, you know, specific programs that would be considered aligned. So that's like, you know, potentially an opportunity for advocacy. I know that some members of the Read by Fourth Teacher Preparation Committee have been in touch with PDE and offered support as they're developing those competencies and guidelines to try to make sure that those are written in as useful a way as possible and help to identify those exemplars and programs. I know we've got, you know, I think I saw AM Academy here as well. We've got, you know, providers and organizations who are really skilled and are supporting other states in their implementation and training of educators. And so there are a lot of resources that we can point to. And again, some ed prep programs within the state who are also have been working with the International Dyslexia Association to incorporate their knowledge and practice standards. And so there are a lot of really great bright spots to build upon in Pennsylvania. And we're hopeful that as they get into the details, they'll be looking at those.
I said thank you, but I didn't. I was muted.
Okay.
Laura, hi, it's Jennifer Deemer from Wilkes-Barre. We talked a few weeks ago, and we're looking forward to our own Lunch and Learn that we'll be hosting with you in June. My question is, how is this going over so far with teacher preparation programs? Have you already started to receive any kind of feedback or input?
I can speak more to their reception of the culturally relevant and sustaining education piece than to the structured literacy piece, although I suspect that some of my colleagues can comment on that a little bit more. In terms of culturally relevant and sustaining education, in general, the teacher prep programs have been supportive of it, and we're, PACT, the Pennsylvania Association of Colleges and Teacher Educators, which is the statewide association, they were supportive of that change within the regulations. In our survey, one thing that we found that they pointed to as a barrier is just capacity and their sort of time and resources to revise all of their curricula and make sure that it's aligned. And so I know that that's likely to be a concern with the structured literacy pieces as well. I do know that there is, we wouldn't be teaching reading the way that we are in our educator preparation program if there weren't some strong beliefs from faculty and staff that the way that they're teaching it right now is the best way to teach it. And I do know that there are pockets of resistance from within certain departments where they feel like the balanced literacy approach and the way that they have been teaching it is a better way. They say that the structured literacy approach is really only needed for students with dyslexia, and we shouldn't be using it across the board. I don't agree with that perspective, but I do think there is a little bit more sort of, I guess, ideological resistance there that's going to need to be overcome. And we're really going to need to think thoughtfully about the professional development that's offered to those ed prep program faculty and staff.
If I could just add, hi, Jennifer, I'm Nancy Scharf from Read by Fourth, where we've been working on teacher preparation for some time in the science of reading. And it's really in line with what Laura is saying. What we find is there's a growing acceptance of the science of reading, but it's mostly coming from individual professors and departments in the schools of education, and specifically the special educators who have really been working overtime with kids who are struggling to read and have embraced the science of reading. But what we're seeing is that there's movement, and dialogue among the professors in bringing the larger school of education along. And in Pennsylvania, I think we have 11 programs that are accredited by the IDA, and it's far more than any other state. So it's not great, but we're certainly moving in the right direction, and that dialogue is happening.
Thank you, Nancy. When we have our Lunch and Learn in June, we have the Dean of Education participating from Wilkes University, which is a pretty significant campus in our community. King's College as well, another strong teacher prep program, and they are all ears. So we're excited that we at least have the engagement at this point.
Great.
That's great. And getting the deans on board is really important, particularly if they are not, I've had some conversations with some deans who, if their sort of particular background is not in reading, they're sort of like, I don't even know what the debate is about, and they haven't necessarily even tuned in. So I think it's really important to engage the deans in particular, and groups like the Deans Forum is another venue for that, which is deans of education from across the state.
I'm wondering if I can put one of our partners on the spot here, and if this is unfair, please just push back and say you don't have the answer, you'll get back to us. But Caitlin, I'm curious about Teach for America as a source of teachers and how your preparation aligns with this conversation, and just any other insight you can add. And if you don't have that answer, I know it's not your role at TFA, so.
No, ironically, I do sit on the same committee that Nancy was just talking about and Laura's on for Read by Fourth. And so it's my adopted role. So Teach for America, specifically in Philadelphia, as well as national, has been trying to figure out the best way to increase the access of our teachers to science-based reading instruction. And so locally, we have gone back and forth with supporting Teach for America alumni-led schools and bringing in like their own teachers and literacy coaches, et cetera, and or working with our second year teachers and mandating that like our K-2 teachers and special ed teachers, kind of the same groups that was on that slide, groups of teachers are getting training in the science of reading. And we have partnered with AIM Academy, who somebody named is also on this call, to do that work. I'm really excited to see this. And one of the things we've been talking about internally is, great, so at some point, given whatever timeline is set up, we don't want it to be with like all due deliberate speed. We want it to be like a pretty, as quick of a turnaround as possible. At some point, our teachers will be getting this as they go through their teacher training, which they do at TFA, because we're all an alternate cert program, like during their first year and second year of teaching, sometimes if they're getting a master's. They'll get it there, and that's fantastic and super exciting. And until then, how can we disseminate this kind of support out as much as possible? And there is some work to do it at the national level as well. Thanks for asking.
I saw Simone's question in the chat. There are clear next steps for systems leaders and funders in terms of building capacity and training around the science of reading and culturally relevant practices. Are there things families and communities should know or do to support this work? That's a great question. My first instinct is to say it would be really helpful to have families and communities doing some district level advocacy to encourage districts to be doing this same type of training with their in-service, their current educators. Because like I mentioned, there have not yet been regulation changes that affect the general PD requirements for current teachers. And we know a lot of teachers went through programs that didn't already incorporate this type of training. Teach Plus is working. We're going to be doing an event in June for community members focused on how they can advocate at the district level for different types of equitable practices, including culturally relevant education training for teachers. And I think that that's something that community members can, go to your school board, go to your superintendent and say, what are we doing to ensure that our current teachers are getting PD in culturally relevant practice, as well as the science of reading? That would be a really sort of specific thing that you could push for. And I know that the Read by Fourth Teacher Preparation Committee would be happy to sort of help you if you need language or a template for a letter or a speech that you could make in regards to that.
Do you think, I want to ask people who work more directly with families or represent families, do you think what Laura just suggested is currently feasible, or are there other resources you would need to support families to be ready to do that? Something for us to keep our eye on, because I think there's a path forward, but whether families and programs are ready to kind of push that lever and have everything they need to do so, I think we need to dig a little further.
Yeah, go ahead, Simone.
Oh, no, sorry. I was just going to say, I think that's why the training that you mentioned to kind of help families and communities kind of give them the language and tools to talk about it, I feel like is a really super tangible resource. So I can't wait for that to come along. And I'll definitely be sharing it with our parent council as well, that's an opportunity coming up.
Great. And if folks have suggestions of the types of resources that would be helpful, that's something that we're trying to put together. We're thinking about, a template letter to send to a superintendent. And, there are our partners nationally at Education Trust have put together some good resources similar to that we're sort of focused on empowering community members to advocate around ESSER funding, stimulus funding, but we're borrowing some ideas from there, some surveys that could be shared at the district level around student belonging and how they can collect data in order to better understand how culturally proficient their staff are currently and what the experience is for students of color. So we would love input as we're working to develop kind of that equity toolkit. When mentioned in school board or community meetings, has science of reading run into any of the objections voiced by critical race theory critics? Great question from Jill. To my knowledge, no, but if anybody has any other, different perspectives, please share them. I can say that, in a number of communities across the country, as well as that have embraced the science of reading, it really has been parent advocacy that has helped to push that forward, particularly parents of dyslexic children or parents of children who were behind in reading. And so, a lot of that happened before the current critical race theory education culture wars. But I do know that parent advocacy has been really effective at both the local and state level in policy changes and in ensuring that teachers are trained in the science of reading. In terms of the cultural relevance piece, we have so far, knock on wood, not seen that get sort of sucked into the critical race theory debate. I sort of think it might be only a matter of time. We've seen social emotional learning most recently get sucked in and be equated with critical race theory. But right now, that's one of the benefits of this regulatory process being a little bit obscure and not in the newspapers and not necessarily even on the General Assembly's radar, is it was able to pass through unimpeded and did not, face any backlash or just kind of getting embroiled in that whole polarizing mess with critical race theory.
My question is based in part on the idea of parents objecting to thinking that their children are being identified as incapable of reading. If this is just taught blanketly to all students, some folks might say, my kid's fine, he doesn't need this. So, yeah, thanks.
I haven't seen that yet, but I think that's it never hurts to anticipate what particular objections might be, so you can be prepared with your counterpoints.
Yeah. Maybe kids can learn to read if they're reading banned books.
I'm not going to go there, but
Laura, what are the sort of like milestones that you all will be looking at in the next few years, like in terms of like the changes that you hope to see as a result of the regulation changes? Are there like specific metrics that you all are tracking that are, especially critical for gauging success?
That's a great question. I'd say we've been very focused on kind of the immediate getting the regulations approved. And now the next step is getting these competencies finalized, which is supposed to be happening according to PDE by late July. And kind of trying to keep that process moving as quickly as possible has been our primary focus. I think, obviously in the long run, we would like to see student achievement improve, and specifically, the percentage of students reading on grade level by end of third grade, beginning of fourth grade increase. But I think as PDE, hopefully in partnership with many of us, is developing those implementation guidelines and thinking about how they're going to incorporate this into the major review that all of the educator prep programs have to go through every few years. We'll be helping to think about how will we measure success at the ed prep program level, and how can we measure sort of those intermediate points of success to show that this is actually being adopted and changing teacher practice. So I don't have specific answers for you now, but that's a great question.
Laura, I have was someone else?
Oh.
I have a follow-up question to Alex's question, which is not so much about the metrics, but just the timing. Like, from your experience on a policy level, after you get something like this passed, what does the timing look like, or what would you expect the timing would look like in terms of when you would see these changes being implemented in teacher prep programs?
A lot of that is going to be dependent on how quickly PDE chooses to move, and how much of a priority they make this. As I mentioned, they've committed to getting these competencies in the implementation guidelines finalized by the end of the summer, and then that should give us a better sense of exactly when it's going to be sort of a requirement that ed prep programs are held accountable for. I would anticipate that's going to be probably in more like the 1 to 2 years stages. I know that in terms of cultural proficiency, a lot of programs have already over the past few years started to take steps, and our survey bears this out, but are not all the way there. They're somewhere in the sort of like inconsistent, or we've got it in one course, but not across all of our courses. And so the role of advocacy orgs like ours is to try to make sure it happens as quickly as possible. But it is probably going to be a matter of years before it's fully implemented.
Laura, do you want to comment about what's happening with, I think it's House Bill 2045, and there's a whole push to make sure there's funding for science of reading professional development for teachers in the field. So that's going to push things forward.
Sure. So yes, you did learn about this on Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law. So there's a House Bill 2045. I'm going to put the link in the chat, that was introduced by Representative Jason Ortitai, who is a Republican legislator from the Pittsburgh area. This is separate from, but aligned with the regulation changes in Chapter 49. It was introduced this spring. There are some amendments that have been proposed. It's passed through the House and is now in consideration in the Senate. And essentially what this bill would do is it would also it has some requirements for educator preparation programs to make sure that they're aligned, which again is the direction that the department is going anyway. But it also would require that the Department of Education offer training for all educators who want it in the science of reading through a free virtual course, as well as offering training for coaches in some of the lowest performing districts in terms of reading that's aligned with the science of reading, so that can then become a part of the coaching and professional development for all teachers. Nancy, if I'm forgetting provisions of the bill, I'm not an expert on every piece of it, but I think that's the gist of it. Some of us have been a part of conversations to introduce some amendments just to give a little bit more teeth to the bill, as well as have conversations with the Senate Education Committee to try to build support for the bill. So that is a step, that shows the legislature is also getting interested in this issue, and we are hopeful that that would be, a first step towards, additional funding and support, and growing from more like a pilot within this bill to something that would be more widespread and kind of across all districts in Pennsylvania over the next few years as we demonstrate success. So if you are writing your legislators, you can write them and tell them, please support House Bill 2045, the Senate version of that. But that's another policy avenue to try and advance this type of training and work.
Do you know of organizations, Laura, that are either like encouraging their membership to reach out to their legislators, or like providing talking points or anything like that, like support for just average parents or citizens?
Not on that bill so far. We're part of sort of an informal coalition that Children First here in Philadelphia has sort of led on, and the focus so far has been primarily on that individual outreach to some of these key committee members to get it brought forward in committee. I will definitely sort of circle back if it becomes a larger legislative push. I think, to get a little bit wonky again, oftentimes there's a pathway for bills like this that have passed through at least one chamber. If they don't get passed through the regular legislative process, to get incorporated into something called the school code that gets passed every June along with the budget, and then governs, it has the effect of law, but it doesn't necessarily have to go through that whole process. So I think that there might be some thinking that might be the pathway, since this bill has already been passed, I believe unanimously in the House, that it might have a chance of kind of working its way into the school code.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to point out a great question in the chat from Gianna. And please, Gianna, if I mess up your question, correct me, but she's leading a summer literacy program out of her community. And the Director of Education is looking for resources to incorporate the science of reading and culturally relevant practices into that program. Does anyone have any resources that they could suggest? And Gianna, if please correct me if I am missing a piece.
No, that's basically the gist of what I was asking. And also, how can we as an organization be a resource to the community to bring them to be able to voice their opinion about it to the district?
I would probably defer to some of my colleagues on the first piece, although one person I would recommend talking to is Sharif El-Mekki from the Center for Black Educator Development, because their Freedom Schools Literacy Academy is a summer program that they run where they have, primary school students, like K-2 students coming in for literacy instruction. And it's also sort of a teacher pipeline program for teachers of color where they have high school students and college students supporting. But they've worked really closely with Dr. Nell Duke, who I'm not going to remember which institution she's at, but she has supported them in developing a curriculum that is very aligned with the science of reading. And they also are very intentional about culturally responsive practice and building in positive racial identity development into their programming. So Sharif would be a great resource. University of Michigan, thanks, that sounds right. I was like, it's somewhere up in the Midwest. He I know has been really intentional about building that into their summer programming, but in terms of like a specific curriculum, I don't have.
The meeting is going on. She asked me a question.
Anybody else have other suggestions in terms of resources for developing or adopting a summer program curriculum?
Are they connected with the library? I know the library actually provides a training in curriculum materials.
I think the center is a Read by Fourth partner. I'm not sure how officially they're connected with the library, but I'd be happy to connect you with Sharif if that's of interest, or one of the other folks on the staff that lead the summer academy.
Okay.
Yeah, they're not directly connected to the library, although I know that at a staff level, people know each other. And I would recommend finding the right people other than Sharif, just because I know he's doing a ton of traveling and national work, and it'll be hard to get his attention. But there are the link that Caitlin put in is probably the right link. But if anybody's really trying to build a connection and not getting in, just reach out to Laura or myself or Caitlin. I'm sure there's several of us who can help make connections on this call.
And one other resource, which isn't directly for summer programming, but if you're looking for resources to talk about the science of reading with families, Read by Fourth has a parent workshop for early literacy skills that is a kind of prefab workshop where we have all of the resources and materials that have already been made. And we can kind of do a train the trainer with you to bring that to your community as well. That's more of a hands-on workshop that would be with the parents in the room, but I think there's lots of tips and resources that could be useful, whether that's directly in your summer programming, or I know you do a lot of programming outside of that too, that I think could be a good resource.
Okay. I want to reach out to everybody who you all recommend, because, and I do have access to Sharif to reach out to him as well. And I'm sure our director of education has a listing of resources as well. But again, we just try to make sure that we take advantage of everything available so that we can give the children the best for them, so they can get to where they need to be in the process.
You know what, there's a report also from Sharif's work that I'm remembering from the first year that they did their summer literacy program that kind of breaks down their approach, that I'm going to look for and send that around as well.
Okay. That would be awesome. Thank you so much.
And Gianna, it looks like Jennifer Deemer just mentioned in the chat that Shayna Terrell at the Center for Black Ed has been a good resource for them. So I just wanted to make sure that you saw that in the chat there.
I did. And will we be able to get a copy of the chat as well?
Yes, I can make sure that we send that out when we provide the link to the slides and the recording after the session today.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So we've got about 8 more minutes left for today's session. What other questions or what else is on people's minds about science of reading, policy, etc.?
I'll make one more plug, and I'm going to put a link into the chat. We have worked with teachers across the Commonwealth on these regulation changes that we talked about, and as well as a number of different policy issues like equitable school funding, early childhood education, culturally affirming schools, expanding and diversifying the teacher pipeline. If you know of great public school teachers and early childhood educators in Pennsylvania, our policy fellowship applications are open for next year through this coming Monday. So I'd love if you would share that link with them, or you can nominate them through a button on that link. So it's a great opportunity for current educators who are really passionate about advancing change through policy.
And in a similar vein, I'll put a plug in for another Read by Fourth partner who's not on this call, but Reading Aloud has an incredible grant from William Penn Foundation to diversify the core of tutors who are trained in Wilson tutoring, which is aligned to the science of reading. And it's really a pathway for those folks to have a career as a tutor. But the purpose is to have more tutors in the city that are trained, aligned to the science, and look like the students who are seeking that tutoring. So if you're interested in pursuing that path, it's a scholarship that covers the cost of that training, which is a pretty significant cost. It is a significant time commitment, but I think this is a great opportunity for people from the community who are looking for that kind of career change and that kind of knowledge.
That's great. Laura, just really broadly, what are some of the other ways that come to mind that funders can help by support this kind of work?
Well, speaking of the William Penn Foundation, I know, for example, they are currently supporting the Pennsylvania Educator Diversity Consortium, which is a coalition that we're a part of, with a grant to convene a number of educator prep programs in the region to support them through a community of practice around improving their program's ability to train teachers in the culturally relevant and sustaining education competencies. I could see similar types of communities of practice to support ed prep programs around the science of reading and structured literacy. Ideally, we would also see the Department of Education serving in that convening role, but I think, there's the potential for funders to kind of pilot that model and show some success there, as well as to support districts in training for their teachers. And so those are some ways, and I'm sure that, there are other ways as well that different organizations and partners can come up with to help to develop educators in these different areas.
Yeah.
Maybe just to add to that, actually the Tremaine Foundation is supporting the process of teacher education programs getting IDA knowledge and practice standards accredited. It's about a $6,000 or $7,000 process and takes a lot of time for the university to go through that review process, and they're covering the cost, which turns out is really important to many, many universities to at least for whoever's advocating for the review process to say it's not going to cost anything. It's going to take people's time, but it's going to be covered by the Tremaine Foundation. So just to put that in people's minds, any program that's seeking IDA accreditation in the state, we can work with you on making sure that the cost is covered by Tremaine.
And just a quick note for everyone, we will, in addition to the notes and the recording and slides from the session, we'll check in with Laura before we email everyone, but we'll provide resources and links that we've discussed here so that hopefully we don't lose some of these connections and ideas that folks have been mentioning. So always happy to make introductions or make connections if there's something on your mind that you think would be useful after the session today. Great. Let's see. Don't see any other questions in the chat. So we can go ahead and thank Laura for your time today and for putting together such a great presentation and facilitating this conversation. We appreciate it.